Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell, and the weather is a little bit all over the place right now. It's like windy and the sun is intermittently popping out, so we're just going to do the best we can and charge forward. But today is going to be my March wrap-up. So I read 7 books in the month of March, and 4 of those have already been talked about in detail in other videos. So the first 3 were in my 5-star predictions blog, and that was The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, Babel by R.F. Kuang, and The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. Then I read Little Women, and for that one, I did a video where I was comparing Little Women to 2 of its most recent movie adaptation. Those were both super fun videos this month. So I will talk just briefly about those 4 books and then go into a little bit more detail on the last 3 books that I read this month, which were Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill, and Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. So to kick off, we'll talk about The Way of Kings. Like I said, I'll make this pretty brief because it's like a 1,000-page book, and I already talked about it in my 5-star predictions vlog, so I will be sure to link that down below. But this was a 6-star read for me. Like, I'm still lingering over all of the details of what a fantastic, not only world and characters, but just story overall I was totally enamored with. And I cannot wait to dive into book 2 of the Stormlight Archives. But this is my first time ever reading The Way of Kings, and I would summarize by saying this is a story about war and family politics for the most part. But the world is extremely magical. It's very unlike most standard fantasy worlds. The climate, the cultural norms and taboos, everything about it is just completely different from anything else I've ever read. There are 3 main characters in The Way of Kings. There's Kaladin, who starts off the story as a soldier, and he is trying to work his way up the ranks so that he can join the king's army. And very quickly in the early parts of the book, he is enslaved, and we have to kind of spend the rest of the book figuring out what happened between the time when he was like a great soldier to this enslavement when we see him 8 months later in the story. He also has a magical little, they're called like wind springs. That's like a little spirit that is following him around, and only he can see it, and he's not really sure why. The second main character is a woman named Shallan. She is a noblewoman, and her father has recently passed away and left their family in horrible debt. They have no really ethical means of paying off that debt on their own, her and her brothers. And so they devise this plan where she is going to go and become an apprentice or a ward of the princess and then steal the princess's magical ring in order to basically pay back their family's debts. And so in the meantime, they're trying to keep it hush-hush that their father has died because they don't want anyone to come collecting. The third main character is High Prince Dalinar. He is the uncle of the king, and he is also a soldier and a general, and obviously one of the king's close advisors. They are involved in a war of vengeance because their previous king, which was the current king's father, was assassinated. And so they are in a war against the people who assassinated the previous king. And Dalinar has been a renowned soldier for many, many years, but he's getting older, and there are these intense high storms that devastate this world on a regular basis. And every time these high storms hit, as of late, Dalinar has had these really intense visions, and he's not sure if they're true or not, and he's not sure where the visions are coming from, and he's a little worried that he's going mad. So that's basically the setup, the premise for The Way of Kings. Did you see that catch? That was great. Yeah. I swear it wasn't this windy a few minutes ago when I was not recording. Anyway, Way of Kings, absolutely fantastic. Will definitely probably be in my top 10 books of the year unless another book in the Stormlight Archives usurps it, because I just can't imagine not having this book, or at least one of the books in the story, in my top 10 of the year. It was so, so good. Then I had The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirafi, which is a pirate story. And it's based in the same world as The City of Brass, the Daevabad trilogy, if you've read that, but it's set many hundreds of years earlier. It follows a woman who used to be a super badass pirate, but she's in her 40s now. She's retired. She has a child. She's just kind of trying to live a quiet life. And then a woman comes to her who is the mother of one of her former crewmates and tells her that her granddaughter, the daughter of her former crewmate who she was very close with, has been kidnapped. And so it's kind of this like, come out of retirement, one last mission, get the band back together, and let's go rescue the girl. It obviously quickly escalates and gets way out of hand. It's way more than she bargained for. There's like an evil sorcerer involved. There's these occult objects. There's tentacled sea monsters. It's literally everything that you would want out of a fantastic pirate story. Very much gave me the same sort of feeling that I used to have watching Pirates of the Caribbean when I was a kid. So highly, highly recommend this one. I thought the setup for the next 2 books in the series is really exciting, and I can't wait until the sequel comes out. That was another 5-star for me this month. Then Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is the same author as Yellowface and the Poppy War trilogy, all of which I have read. So I was really looking forward to Babel. It's a fantastical dark academia story about a boy named Robin who is Chinese, and he is taken from his home at a very young age because his whole family dies of a plague, and he is taken in by an English professor who basically trains him up to be a linguistics scholar at Oxford. And at Oxford is the most renowned linguistics institute in the entire world, basically. And the magic system in Babel is based around linguistics and translation, and also silver. So basically how it works is you can inscribe words on silver bars in English and then on another side in another language. And basically what is lost in translation between 2 different words is what creates the magical effect. And the effect can be different based on the meanings of the words. And so the way it was explained in the book is a word like to understand. In English, if you were to say that same word in Chinese, it will mean to understand, but it might also have connotations of like to clarify or to illuminate. And so that magical effect might be like energy or light or clarity or something like that. So very interesting. The whole book was kind of a commentary on not really academia so much as I would expect out of a dark academia, although that was a big part of it, but it was mostly about colonialism and taking from other cultures. And I thought that those parts of the story were very clear. She often used kind of a blunt bludgeoning instrument, I think, to get her point across. I don't think that took away from the story because I think that was the entire point of the book. But now having had a few weeks to kind of digest this book, I originally gave it 5 stars. I think I might drop it down to like a 4.5 just because the middle part of the story did drag a little bit. But I did think that all of the talk around linguistics and translation and colonialism was very fascinating, and I was engaged the entire time. Then Little Women, as you know, if you already watched my other video, I had a great time with Little Women. I was not expecting to love this book as much as I did, just because it is kind of a slice of life tale, and it's historical. It's about 4 sisters who grew up together during the Civil War era and just the trajectories of all of their separate lives. It's a very autobiographical from Louisa May Alcott, who was a very interesting character, which I talk more about in my Little Women video. But so the main character, Jo March, is based very heavily on her, and what happens in all of the girls' lives is based pretty heavily around her actual family and sisters that she grew up with. But I just found, even though this book was very slow paced, that I was super immersed in what was happening in all of their lives. I cared about the things that they cared about. I felt their excitement. I felt their pain. I felt their sorrow when tragedy struck. And I just thought, it was really interesting to actually get a look inside what women of that era were thinking. And oftentimes when we look back at history, we don't get to know about what women's lives were like. But I just thought the characters in it were fantastic. There was even her youngest sister, which I talked about before, but her youngest sister I actually thought was like really petty and annoying when she's like 12, and then by the end of the book when she's like in her early 20s, I just thought she was so fantastic, like her growth over the story. Like I said, I was just really invested. So if you haven't read Little Women, I would highly recommend it. Yeah, it was a great classic, and I understand why it's a classic now. Okay, so that's it for the books I've already talked about. I know I just said I would make it short, and then I never end up doing that. But next up, I read Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, and I have very mixed feelings about this. As you can see, I tabbed quite a bit of it. This is without a doubt the most beautifully written prose that I have read all year thus far, and I've read 31 books now. The writing in here is like really, really gorgeous. There's basically two timelines in this story. The first timeline is following an Amelia Earhart type figure. She is a young woman who becomes a pilot, and she disappears later in life while she is attempting to circumnavigate the globe. I think her life story starts in like the 1920s, and so it's like the 1950s, I think, when she disappears. And then the second story is following a young woman 100 years later in like the 2020s, who is the Hollywood actress who is cast to play the pilot who disappeared and to tell her story on the big screen. And the Hollywood actress is a young woman who's kind of had a lot of bumps along the way in her career. She was like originally kind of like a Hannah Montana figure, it sounds like, where she was given like her own kids' TV show, and then later she's cast as like the heroine in kind of what I was interpreting as like a Twilight or Hunger Games-esque series. And in the middle of that saga of being the heroine for this popular like young adult series, she's caught up in this kind of sex scandal and is kicked off of the franchise. And so she's hoping this new movie where she's playing this great historical figure is going to be kind of the comeback for her career. So why do I have such mixed feelings about this? I was really excited to read this. I think I first heard about it on Reagan's channel, and she really talked it up. And I have always been fascinated by Amelia Earhart ever since I was a young girl, and I just thought this sounded really cool. I also, just based on the description, was getting kind of Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo sort of vibes from the actress storyline, and I was excited about that as well. But the historical saga of like how this young woman in the 1920s like becomes a pilot, and she serves in the World War and all of that, World War II, all of that kind of stuff, I was really excited to read. So the part that is so disappointing about this book is that there was just so much sexual trauma in this book. There is pedophilia on multiple uncomfortable levels. There's sexual assault in a marriage. There is descriptions of a young girl who's like 11 masturbating. There's just a lot of stuff in here that I felt super uncomfortable reading, and I was like, I don't understand why the author made these choices. I actually considered DNFing it probably about a third of the way through, because I was just like, why do we keep talking about this? Like I felt like every chapter had some sort of thing like that in it at the start of the story, and I just didn't want to be reading that, I was like, this feels almost pornographic. I understand at some points why the author wanted to contextualize these women in these ways, but I don't feel like there needed to be so much of it on page, so to speak. Gosh, it is funny. I did decide to push through and to keep reading because I kept hoping that the story was going to carry it. Even if the personal choices that the author made were not my favorite, I did still think the writing was absolutely beautiful, and I was really engaged by the stories of the two different women, minus all of those parts of those stories. I think this could have been a book that I absolutely raved about and found a lot of joy in, like celebrating these women's stories. And ultimately, I'm just left feeling a bit empty after the reading experience. I'm giving it 3 stars just because I think the aspirations of this book were really good. And the writing was, like I said, unparalleled, but it just was not anything like I wanted it to be. I wish the author had made different choices and I could be saying something different, because I think the potential between these covers is just like sky high. LOL. I did find all of the talk about flying super fascinating. It was very poetic. It really made me think about the sky and our place on planet Earth, like in a deep sort of way. So I do appreciate the book for those reasons, but I can't really say that I recommend it. Second to last book of the month was When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill. And this one is another one that ended up being a bit of a disappointment, another 3-star book. This is a story about an alternate world in which women can actually turn into dragons. And it's considered very taboo. It's set in the 1950s. And so if you imagine the same like squeamishness and cultural taboos or societal taboos that we still have to this day, but even more so in the 50s, like talking about like women's menstruation or any sort of like lady issues. That's exactly how dragoning is treated in this book. I did like a lot of the social commentary around like women's place in society and power and the taboos that we have around being a woman. And so I did really like all that aspect of it. The part that I didn't like about this book, because I did think the world was fascinating, was the story itself. We're following a young girl. There was an event called the Mass Dragoning in 1955 when like over 600,000 women all on the same day turned into dragons. And she is a very young child when this happens, and her aunt is one of the women that turns into a dragon, and all the dragons just like fly away. Her mother refuses to talk to her about this. She's not allowed to ask questions about dragons. Like even within her own household, her family's like too embarrassed to talk about it. So she just kind of grows up in this dark bubble. Obviously, they don't talk about it at school and things like that either. And so it's just kind of this big question mark that she has her whole life. And it's just her story, just like an insignificant little girl and her growing up. In the meantime, there are like secret societies of scientists who are trying to study dragoning as a phenomenon and learn about it and try and understand like why some women turn into dragons, why other women don't. If all women have these abilities, is it triggered by puberty? Is it triggered by being a mother? Is it triggered by, you know, like hormones? Like they're just trying to figure out all this different stuff. Can men turn into dragons too? But they are persecuted by the government, and all of their, if they are ever caught, all of their research is completely blacklisted and erased, and they're fired from their jobs. And so in my head the whole time, I'm like, why aren't we following one of those people? Like, let me follow a scientist who's like covertly trying to study dragons. Like, that's the story I want to hear about while they're like on the run from the government. That would have been a much more interesting way to tell the story. And so ultimately, I didn't feel any strong feelings reading this book in regards to the story itself of the character that we were following through it. I thought it was interesting. I don't regret reading it, but I just feel like it just kind of made me feel like the author didn't really know what she wanted to do with the story. And I felt like it was a big missed opportunity. But again, I did think the social commentary and the conversations that it brought up were interesting. And I could see how this would have made like a good book club book. And then finally, the last book that I read, which I just finished earlier today, is Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. And this was written in 2015, published in early 2016. And I believe the tagline is something like Ferguson, Palestine. I can't remember. I'll put it up here. It's very short. I think it's only like 150 pages. And it's basically just a collection of essays and speeches along with an interview with Angela Davis that she gives throughout a number of years, I think from like 2013 to 2015, perhaps. And specifically, she is talking about what happened in Ferguson, the issues in Palestine, but also just the intersectionality and the global struggle for freedom and how we need to be viewing all of these issues as interconnected because they are. She talks about how the prison industrial complex and the militarization of police and capitalistic individualism and detention and deportation of immigrants and institutional racism are all birds of the same feather, I guess I would say. But the way she talked about these things as being so interconnected, and she talks about so much more than that, you know, feminism and history and all of these different global movements, the civil rights movement and all of these different things. She just talks about it with so much clarity and sense of purpose, and she really makes the arguments very succinctly in a way that I've never been able to really put to words. And I found it very insightful and just really like a must read. I was absolutely like gobbling up the pages as I was going through it. The one thing I will say is that it is very repetitive in terms of it is just like a collection of speeches that she's made basically at different engagements over these couple of years. And so a lot of it is very repetitive in terms of sometimes she even uses like the exact same facts and figures or examples from one to the next. This was my first time ever reading anything by Angela Davis, and it was very inspiring. Wow, what a monumental figure that I think we're all very lucky to be alive at the same time as her. So, yeah, highly recommend Freedom is a Constant Struggle, especially in light of what's going on in Palestine now and the Israeli apartheid situation. I also think it would be really interesting for her to give an update to this book now, post-pandemic George Floyd, and with everything else that has gone in the world since then, if she could kind of make those connections to the things that she was talking about then and how they're even more relevant now. So that's it as far as my March reading wrap up. Had a really great reading month, even though there was a couple of duds in there. For the most part, it was really, really fantastic. Also, of course, if you've read any of the books that I talked about in March, let me know what you thought of those books. And if you haven't read any of those books yet, just let me know what your favorite book was that you read in the month of March. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me for a little bit today. As always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you soon.